Good afternoon, everyone. In a previous sermon, I began a discussion of the subject of the Messiah and the throne of David. It was pointed out that Yahweh, the God of Israel, was the king over the nation of Israel from the time it was established with the covenant of Mount Sinai, and for that matter, even before that. Actually, in a sense, the nation was established at the time of Abraham, but eventually the Israelites, having become a nation, longed for a human king, and God told his prophet Samuel to appoint Saul as their king, a man named Saul of the tribe of Benjamin. And Saul was appointed king, and he, however, proved disloyal to God, and God rejected his dynasty and appointed a new king, a young man named David, of the house or lineage of Judah. David proved faithful to God despite mistakes he made, and God gave him the promise of a permanent dynasty. Through the prophet Nathan, God told David, as we read in 2 Samuel 7 and verse 16, 2 Samuel 7, verse 16, "And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever." But let's back up a bit today and ask the question, did David in fact exist at all? Did David even exist? Was there a King David? Did King David of Judah sit on a throne to be passed down to succeeding generations? If you are familiar at all with the way critics of the Bible, so-called liberal scholars, and liberal is actually too nice a name for many of them, in my opinion, but if you're familiar with how these critics operate, at least many of them, you shouldn't be surprised that some who have commented on the era of David and Solomon, as we read in the book Unveiling the Kings of Israel by David Down, and he comments that some of these scholars, many of them, scoff at the biblical record, as he puts it. They scoff at the biblical record. They denigrate it, they reject it, they ridicule it. Quoting from a book entitled David and Solomon by Israel Finkelstein and Neil Silberman, we read this, quote, "Many of the famous episodes in the biblical story of David and Solomon are fictions, historically questionable or highly exaggerated." They are fictions, historically questionable or highly exaggerated. In other words, they are a pack of lies, is what they're saying. Concerning Jerusalem, they say, again, this is quoting from Down's citation of their book, David and Solomon. As for Jerusalem, quote, "The archaeological data from Jerusalem have shown that the settlement of the 10th century BCE was no more than a small, poor highland village." Now, the 10th century BCE was the century of the reigns of David and Solomon. And so what they're saying is that, again, the Bible is a lie, that it was just a small, poor highland village of no significance or importance whatsoever. The vast stores of gold and all of the other things that we read of in the reign of Solomon, and for that matter in the reign of David, were just fictitious. Again and again, this type of scholar has drawn far-reaching conclusions from what he does not know. or what he has not found. What he does not know and what he has not found. In other words, he's drawing conclusions from a state of ignorance. Egyptologist and archaeologist K.A. Kitchen comments concerning Jerusalem, only 2 to 5% of Jerusalem has been explored by archaeologists, and that, he says, or he implies more or less superficially, saying that little more than a handful of narrow, or of often narrow trenches is pretty much all of the exploration that's been done in Jerusalem. The walls of Jerusalem, as they existed at the time of David and Solomon, he points out, would have been reworked by later kings, and much of the walls were destroyed by the Babylonians. And this is from Kitchen's book on the reliability of the Old Testament. On the reliability of the Old Testament, page 153. He goes on to comment, one cannot dismiss the role of Jerusalem and its ruler merely because we have no rich palace with several tons of pottery. As though that's what we would expect to find. We'd go in there and just find everything intact as it was several thousand years ago. And that's apparently what some of these scholars demand as proof that David or Solomon existed, or the Bible account is accurate. He goes on to say, with 95% of the site untouched and largely unreachable, and massive destruction in late antiquity, it is entirely premature to claim that the limited digs hitherto can be treated as definitive. And I might just add that it's difficult to treat any archaeological findings as definitive. They do give us some information, but I don't know that any archaeological discoveries are necessarily of themselves definitive. He goes on to comment that whatever remains of the city of David and Solomon's era, whatever remains still exists after Neo-Babylonian destruction, Persian age reworking, Herodian replacement, and demolition by Romans and others, are irrevocably buried under the present Temple Mount. I might add that Jerusalem has probably been invaded and destroyed more times than any other city in history, any major city. And the Romans, it was said, didn't leave one stone on top of another when they destroyed the city in the 1st century AD, and then again the following century. Despite the obstacles, however, evidence of habitation prior to the era of David and Solomon have in fact been found in the environs of Jerusalem. For example, we read from Archaeology in the Old Testament World by John Gray the following, quote, on the Ophel Hill, certain portions of the old Jebusite wall have been discovered with revetments of really impressive strength. Gray also comments, quote, among various hydraulic works which derive from the spring of Gihon, there is one which almost certainly dates from the early Hebrew monarchy. That is a channel which follows the contour on the east of Ophel Hill. Ophel Hill is a hill adjacent to where the temple itself was. And Gray goes on to describe it in more detail and says, quote, the purpose of this channel was agricultural, to irrigate the plots in the Kidron Valley, where the king's gardens were. The work was only practicable at a time of unbroken peace and security. No time after the reign of Solomon until the time of Hezekiah would have permitted such a work to be made or freely used. By that time, a further development of the water system was undertaken, the underground conduit to the pool of Siloam, which is just outside where the temple walls are now, or were. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, beginning with verse 5, Ecclesiastes 2, verse 5, I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. Later, when the Babylonian army had penetrated the city, we read in Jeremiah 39, verse 4, Jeremiah 39, verse 4, so it was when Zedekiah, the king of Judah, and all the men of war saw them, this was seeing the Babylonians as they were penetrating the city of Jerusalem at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, says, when Zedekiah, the king of Judah, and all the men of war saw them, that they fled and went out of the city by night, by way of the king's garden, by the gate between the two walls, and he went out by way of the plain. The king's garden, according to biblical testimony, was developed by Solomon, and sometime during his reign, and still existed at the time of the last king of the Davidic dynasty to reign in Jerusalem. And this water system is said by John Gray to have been developed during the early Hebrew monarchy, in other words, the time of Solomon. Perhaps David contributed to it too, but at least it was in that era. There are still other critics who have asserted that David is an entirely fictional character, that he did not exist at all. And they have claimed, as supporting that concept, they have claimed that there is no extra biblical mention of David in extant literature from ancient times. And again, this is the way these critics often work. They take something that they don't know, that cannot be proven, the claim that there is no proof of something, and then make the opposite claim that proves that the written testimony is false. But this is an argument from silence, from ignorance. And even if the claim were true, it proves absolutely nothing. No doubt many rulers of ancient kingdoms have been long since forgotten. Any writings about them decayed, destroyed, or buried. But that does not mean they didn't exist. We do have the testimony of Scripture, and that's really the most important proof of the reality of David and Solomon's existence. But we have the testimony of Scripture that David and Solomon existed, and we have a lot of detailed information about their lives, their personalities, even some of their own writings, as we will discuss later. We might mention, too, that the Israelites, and especially the people in the Jewish kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, kept careful genealogical records. And one of the reasons they did that is because a priest was not allowed to marry anyone who could not prove pure Israelite descent for at least 10 generations. For a woman of Israel to be eligible to marry a priest, she had to go back 10 generations and prove that she was of pure Israelite descent. And they kept careful genealogical records. And we have people at the time of Jesus Christ and since then who have traced their history back to King David. In the period after 953 of the before the Christian era, in other words, BC, the period after about 953 BC, a variety of external sources mention kings of Israel and Judah and people and events connected with them. So why aren't David and Solomon and some others mentioned in the same way? Kitchen comments the main reason is, quote, the kings of Assyria commonly named their adversaries in their reports, and from 853 they came into contact with Israel. That was not the case earlier, end quote. In other words, for many of these later kings of Israel and Judah, the primary extra-biblical sources of information are the records of the Assyrians. And there are some other records as well, but primarily the records for that era outside the Bible concerning kings of Judah and Israel come from Assyria. Nevertheless, in addition to the biblical record, David is in fact mentioned in external sources close to the time of his reign. It was revealed in a book titled Biblical Dan, published in 1994 by Avraham Boran, who had spent years excavating the ruins of the ancient city of Dan, that he had found broken remains of a stela. A stela is a stone monument. He had found broken remains of a stela bearing in Old Aramaic the name of Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, son of Joram, king of the house of David, as it appears in Aramaic on the stela. This is from Kitchen's book on page 37. These two kings, the king of Israel and the king of Judah, were killed at the same time, roughly, by Jehu, circa 841 BC, as recorded in 2 Kings chapter 9, beginning with verse 21. The author of the stela is believed to be Hazael, king of Syria, who had been at war with these kings and whose army had in fact wounded Jehoram, the king of Israel at the time, and one of the ones who was killed here in this at that time, and in accordance with the Bible and also in accordance with the record on the stela. The author of the stela, again, probably Ahaziah, or Hazael rather, Hazael, king of Syria, the author of the stela claims credit for having killed these kings of Israel and Judah, which is not exactly what 2 Kings tells us. It tells us that Jehu actually killed them. But Kitchen comments, it is commonplace for Near Eastern rulers to claim credit for actions by others. And since, end of quote, I might add that going on, that the fact that Hazael was at war with these kings and had In fact, his army had already wounded one of them. He may have considered that he was instrumental in their death, which he probably was. According to Kitchen, David is also mentioned in the Moabite stone, also called the Mesha stela, which dates to about 840 BCE. This stela is associated with Mesha, a Moabite king, where the house of David is mentioned in connection with Israel's occupation of a portion of Moab. So there are at least two instances where David is in fact mentioned in extra-biblical sources dating to ancient times, not too far removed from the time that he reigned. Despite their scoffing at the biblical record, the critics Finkelstein and Silberman admit, quote, "The text seems to preserve some uncannily accurate memories of 10th century BCE conditions." Imagine that. They preserve some uncannily accurate memories of 10th century BCE conditions. The sheer weight of geographical information and long lists of place names interwoven in the stories testify to a familiarity with the ancient landscape of Judah and Israel. So these fictional stories somehow preserved a great deal of very accurate information concerning the conditions of Israel in the 10th century BC. This is significant because it means that the events had to be recorded near the time they happened, not centuries later in mythical tales where such details would be lost, which is what many so-called biblical scholars assert without any proof. In the book, The Battles of the Bible, the authors Chaim Herzog and Mordecai Gachon present a detailed study of a number of battles recorded in the Old Testament, including battles involving David. Chaim Herzog was a British soldier in World War II, later a member of Israel's Defense Forces, a military official, and president of Israel. Mordecai Gachon is an expert in the military history, geography, and archaeology of Israel, as well as a former soldier in the British and Israeli military forces and university professor and author. They comment in their book, quote, "The tactical description of the battles of the Bible in their intricate topographical setting and the subservient, detailed, and logical interaction between movement, maneuvers, and ground features shaping the course of the battles cannot be explained by mere inventiveness." They go on to explain, "We are thus virtually forced to accept the veracity of the tactical narrative of the battles as described in the Bible." And what they're talking about is that the details of these battles are so complete and so accurate that there's no way they could just have been made up as some kind of a mythical tale. They go on to say archaeological research is invaluable both for producing the material background and basis of our research and for providing relevant epigraphical evidence, the more precious because of its scarcity. On the other hand, many of the conclusions drawn by a considerable number of scholars from these sources should firmly be labeled as conjectural and far from being a compelling factual framework. Conscious or subconscious socio-political notions and biases color the basic attitudes of some scholars, and all tend to draw all-embracing final historical conclusions from evidence gathered from the sites, none of which has been excavated completely with sufficient foolproof methods, often before the final and fully processed evidence of their finds has been published. This is to be lamented, especially in many cases where scholars have taken unwarranted liberties with textual corrections, explaining away unsuitable factual evidence as well as disregarding geopolitical realities. However, whatever the verdict of future balanced research will be as to the historical framework and happenings against the backdrop of which we have to view the battles of the Bible, it cannot invalidate their intrinsic truthfulness and authenticity. Being unable in this book to go into discussions that are beyond the scope of matters military, we adhere to the accreditation of exploits to Joshua and other leaders according to the Bible narrative. End quote. According to 1 Samuel chapter 17, 1 Samuel 17, a Philistine army and an Israelite army confronted each other on either side of the valley of Elah, which is southwest of Jerusalem. They were at a standoff, but each day a giant named Goliath taunted the Israelites and challenged them to send someone out to fight him. David, on hearing the challenge, was incensed, and David said, as we read in 1 Samuel 17, verse 26, 1 Samuel 17, verse 26, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Despite his youth, David took up the challenge. Picking up 5 round stones from a wadi in the valley, he ran toward the giant. Now we read from the book I mentioned earlier by David Down, quoting the book. He says, Rechavam Ze'evi, a retired general of the Israeli army, believes it all actually happened. As an experienced officer, he has closely analyzed every aspect of the confrontation and concludes that it is all very plausible. For Rechavam, the Philistines' ancient strategy is textbook material. He who holds the highlands and the mountains controls the lowlands and the coast. It's a lesson we teach in every military command course. Rechavam makes an interesting observation about the duel. He points out that Goliath was lacking one major weapon of the times. He doesn't have a bow. His fighting ability has no range. On the other hand, David does. Not that he has a bow, but his fighting ability has range, is what he's saying. On the other hand, David does. He has his sling. As Rechavam points out, quoting what he says here, "I know Bedouin shepherds who can hit a tin can with a stone flung from a sling at a distance of 75 meters. That's nearly the distance of a football field. That's how accurate some of these people that are skilled in using a sling can be. And so we read in 1 Samuel 17, verse 48, 1 Samuel 17, verse 48, "So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine." So David was on the move. The Philistine evidently stopped waiting to see what David would do. and that was David's chance to fling his stone, which struck the Philistine giant in his forehead, according to Scripture. In connection with David's encounter with Goliath, where David used a stone thrown from a sling to stun Goliath, and then he killed Goliath with his own sword, the authors of the Battle of the Bible state, quote, "Endocrinology has been marshaled to prove convincingly that limited eyesight, common in tall, strong people, could have hampered Goliath's capability to react according to David aiming his sling." What they're saying is that people of Goliath's stature, he was 10 to 11 feet tall and powerfully built, that there are glandular peculiarities often associated with those characteristics which are manifested with poor eyesight. So that could have been part of Goliath's inability to dodge the stone from the sling. At any rate, the account is credible from the standpoint of the military experts who have examined it. Later on, David's followers took the stronghold of Jebus, or Jerusalem, and then after that followed other battles to subdue the Philistines. The authors of battles of the Bible state that David's conquest of Canaanite enclaves that existed to the north of Jerusalem in the plain of Sharon and in the Jezreel Valley following earlier battles is, in their words, quote, borne out by archaeological evidence from systematically excavated sites in the plains. What they're saying is that archaeological evidence shows that what happened at that time did, according to Scripture, did and is supported by the evidence from archaeology. David Down writes in the book mentioned earlier, quote, "Perhaps David's greatest legacy to us is the Psalms he wrote. Psalms are songs accompanied by musical instruments. With David, it was his beloved harp, which should be understood to be a lyre. Full-sized harps were used in Egypt, but obviously David could not have taken such an instrument with him while he tended his sheep. A lyre is a harp-like instrument that's smaller than a full-sized harp. When I was in college, I had a class in ancient history under a professor who, in my judgment, expressed a bitter, angry, sour disposition. She seemed to be a very unhappy person. And she made it clear in her classes that she was contemptuous of the Bible and sought to discredit it in the eyes of her students. On one occasion, she derisively stated that the mention of musical instruments at the time of David was evidence of the Bible's falsity, because according to her, musical instruments weren't invented until hundreds of years later and were first used in Greece, centuries after the time of David. That was what she said. And although I have some idea, I don't know precisely where she got that idea. Egyptologist K.A. Kitchen writes that long before the time of David in Egypt, quote, people were commonly entertained by harpists playing and singing their songs. This is long before the time of David in Egypt. He cites a number of examples of rulers in various parts of the Near East involved in writing hymns and poems similar to David. Clifford Wilson, archaeologist and professor in that incredible book, the Bible, title of a book that he wrote, writes, quote, "We know David as Israel's sweet psalmist. It is only a generation since it was claimed that David could not have established guilds of temple musicians such as those referred to in 1 Chronicles 25. It was argued authoritatively that the formal organization of temple musicians was not known until after the exile in Babylon, over 400 years later than David's time. But again, the Bible claim has been vindicated. Both Palestine and Syria had musicians considerably earlier than David's time, and this is not really surprising, for expression of music has ever been one of man's outlets," end quote. He goes on to say, "It is also well known that in the royal death pits at there were several harps and lyres alongside the skeletons of those who had died as attendants of departed royalty," end quote. Which was on the coast of near where the Euphrates River empties into the sea. Is the birthplace of Abraham, and it is or was one of the world's oldest cities. People were playing musical instruments before the time of Abraham. In fact, the Bible tells us that before the flood, we read in Genesis 4, verse 21, before the flood, Jubal was the father of all those who play the harp and flute. So musical instruments and music and songs have been around for many hundreds of years before the time of David. Excavations at Ras Shamra Ugrit in northern Syria. This was a city in northern Syria in ancient times, which has been extensively excavated. But these excavations have revealed singers in groups associated with religious worship long before the time of David. And yet, Wilson writes, quote, "It had become traditional for modern writers to ascribe most of these psalms, that is, the Psalms of David, to the time of the Maccabees." The Maccabees were leaders in Judah in the 2nd century AD, or BC. In other words, it's 800 years later than David. Wilson goes on to say, "Now it is recognized that the Psalms of David are indeed dated to his times, for various Canaanite expressions which had become obsolete by the time of the Maccabees are used in them." He goes on to say, in this connection, it's interesting to read the comments of a man such as Professor W.F. Albright on the reacceptance of many psalms as belonging to the times of David. In History, Archaeology, and Christian Humanism, which is a book, title of a book written by Albright, he says, Professor Albright refers to the fact that there are still many who hold a Maccabean date for some of the Psalms. He goes on to discuss the great relevance of these findings at Ugrit and shows that in the Hebrew text there are many reflections of archaic use. Then he writes, quoting Albright, "There can be little doubt, in my opinion, that there are scores of psalms whose composition may best be dated in the 10th century or shortly afterwards, and it becomes hypercritical to reject the tradition of Davidic sponsorship, which was tantamount to authorship at that early period, on a substantial nucleus of the present book of Psalms. At long last, we have a solid linguistic basis for a history of Hebrew literature. Dr. Albright further says to attribute such psalms to the Maccabean period is absurd, end quote. John Gray, in the book that I quoted earlier, comments that structures in various parts of Palestine are traced to the period of Solomon. He says, quote, the gateway of Hirbet el Halifa, I guess that's how you pronounce it, which is near the shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, is beyond doubt the work of Solomon, which suggests that the gateway of Megiddo is also the work of his reign. This would support the biblical statement which ascribes to Solomon the fortifications of Megiddo, Gezer, Hazor, and Jerusalem, end quote. Sources also mention the smelting of copper and shipbuilding in the area of Ezion Geber near the Gulf of Aqaba, and Gray states, quote, the town in all probability was built on a virgin site in the early Hebrew monarchy. In other words, the time of David and Solomon. More than likely Solomon, but perhaps David too had some role in that as well. Like David, Solomon also wrote poetry and songs along with Proverbs. Not only are Proverbs attributed to him, but also is the book of Ecclesiastes. Nathan Albright writes in a paper that he wrote called A Case for Solomonic Authorship of Ecclesiastes, quote, there are many people who claim that Ecclesiastes was a Second Temple forgery by a scribe who wrote as if he was Solomon, end quote. I won't go into detail on this, but there are several good reasons to conclude that Solomon wrote the book of Ecclesiastes near the end of his life, not least of which is the profound wisdom found in the book. Some other reasons are discussed in Albright's thesis. There is no good reason to believe it was written by an impostor in the Second Temple period, which is just a fabrication of skeptics bent on discrediting the authenticity of Scripture. For one thing, had it been written at that time, there's no way it would have been accepted into the Hebrew canon. In Kitchen's book I've quoted in this sermon, he devotes over 75 pages to discussing details of evidence in favor of the reality of David and Solomon's reigns and the Bible statements concerning them. So there's much more that could be covered in, if you want to go into a great deal more detail, at least 75 pages worth. Scholars, if you've done much study of the history associated with the Old Testament, you probably realize that scholars are divided over chronology, especially regarding the reigns of Egyptian pharaohs and the time periods labeled as various Bronze Ages and Iron Ages. Despite that, competent scholars have found plenty of evidence to support the biblical narrative, regardless of their differences over how to fit it into particular time periods with regard to correlation or correlating Egyptian and Palestinian history. David Down, one of the authors that I've quoted in this sermon, among others, believes traditional dates of Egyptian history reveal, as he says, alarming inconsistencies. Kenneth Kitchen, whom I've also quoted, on the other hand, insists, and others insist, on the traditional dates assigned to Egyptian rulers. But in both camps are competent scholars who have found compelling evidence to support the biblical historical narrative, including the narrative concerning David. Eugene Merrill, author of an historical survey of the Old Testament, a well-known scholar of Hebrew and Old Testament scholarship, he states in his book, An Historical Survey of the Old Testament, quote, that our present understanding of the Old Testament chronology, especially from the time of David and later, rests on a scientific basis and is not disputed. Let me read that again. Our present understanding of the Old Testament chronology, especially from the time of David and later, rests on a scientific basis and is not disputed. That's his statement. I'll add, however, that it's not quite that simple. There are, in fact, some difficulties with chronology, especially during the era of the kings. But there is general agreement, at least among conservative scholars, that David's reign began about 1010 BCE and Solomon's reign began about 970, I should say, 970 BCE. And there's almost universal agreement on those dates within a year or two. The establishment of Jerusalem as the capital of the United Monarchy set the stage for what follows in the history of ancient Israel. Without this foundation, there is no sensible accounting for the reigns of subsequent kings. Kings who traced their dynasty back to David. The reigns of David and Solomon established the basis for the well-attested history of kings for both the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah that emerged afterward. Eugene Merrill says in the book I just quoted, quote, it's almost impossible to describe the dramatic and far-reaching changes which had occurred in David's 40-year reign over Israel. From a badly divided or at best loosely federated group of distantly spread tribes, the nation had become united, powerful, and comparatively very wealthy. The kingdom of Israel had become a power to be reckoned with, even, perhaps rivaling the world's leading states, end quote. And it was to this King David, sitting on the throne of that kingdom, that God made the promise of an everlasting dynasty. And I hope to continue on this subject later.